Bonjour, bon matin à tous et bienvenue. It's Wednesday, July the 9th, and King Charles declared last night at Windsor Palace that the Entente Cordiale has become the Entente Amiable on the second day of the state visit of President Macron. The King even commissioned a new cocktail for the occasion. It's made of British gin, lemon curd, and French pastis, which may or may not catch on. It's quite an early thought, that one, is it not, Sam Coates? My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gives you everything you need for the day ahead in British politics in 20 minutes. But for all of that pomp, the French president didn't just stick to pleasantries. Emmanuel Macron used a speech to Parliament to urge the UK to recognise the state of Palestine, with the government still mulling what to do about statehood and how to fulfil its manifesto promise to give it recognition. The French president landed on one of the most fraught topics possible in his intervention when addressing MPs and peers inside Parliament.
The state visit will be front and centre of coverage today, with the French president spending time with the King in the gardens of Windsor Castle before heading into London for a meeting about AI at Imperial College, and then on to lunch with the Starmers in Downing Street after Prime Minister's questions. And the visit is perfect for a government trying to get to recess without another mishap.
I think that this government is trying to stay out of trouble, Anne, but there are reminders of the difficulties that it's in everywhere. Just briefly, one of those is going to pop back up in the Commons this afternoon. That's the welfare bill, seen of last week's politically catastrophic climb down. It's back in the Commons because the government did want to ram it through as quickly as possible to escape too much scrutiny. That went well. Of course, it came unstuck last week, gutted the measures and left a £5.5 billion black hole about that. But the remains of that bill are still in the Commons and back today for report stage. And there's another rebellion brewing to punch the government's bruise.
Last night, The Times reported the emergence of an amendment to the bill from Marie Tidball, the Labour MP who's played a leading role in opposing the government's measures. And she has submitted an amendment which would put into law the promise that a review into PIP by Stephen Timms would be co-authored with disability groups. The Times saying that this amendment will be backed by the DWP Select Committee chairs and a few other of the not so usual suspects in rebellions, and it will be selected for a vote today. So that does give the opportunity for another sizable uprising. The bill won't be blocked, but the last thing the government wants is everybody focused back on the fact that there is clearly such strong opposition to a lot of the terms.
And all the chatter behind the scenes, and I'm sure you're picking up as well, is just on how more broadly does this government sort itself out. And there's no way that you don't end up having a bit of a reset over the summer. And indeed, probably in most dimensions. And one of the things I picked up yesterday is talk amongst officials of a restructuring in number 10.
Right, which is officials number 10 restructuring, alarm bells. How would it work?
Well, this will sort it. The idea is that you invent a new role. Well, it's not quite a new role because we've had it before, but you recreate a role that's been there in the past, and you have a permanent secretary in number 10 to run things there. Everybody you talk to thinks that number 10 is a mess and needs better, basically needs to organise things better. The leading candidate for that, amongst officials apparently, is thought to be Olaf Henriksen Bell, who at the moment is leading on the policy side. So he could become a big fromage in number 10. He's actually been our man in Europe, different places, all the way through the Brexit negotiations. He's known very well to Team Macron, as it happens, and is the twin brother of the Labour MP Torsten Bell. One of them dropped the Henriksen and the other didn't. It comes after a story in The Guardian that has been picked up very widely, that Keir Starmer appears unhappy with his own new choice of Cabinet Secretary Chris Wormald.
It was an extraordinarily aggressive briefing there against the most senior figure in the civil service, and it claiming that number 10 folk had buyer's remorse about the guy who's been barely running the show for 6 months and was clearly a personal choice of the Prime Minister. Now, multiple sources that we're both speaking to saying that people around Starmer have kind of formed a view that Chris Wormald isn't radical enough. Some go further and say it's disastrous for the prospects of radical reform of the civil service. It sounds a bit like you've picked up a lot more thinking about why that is.
Yeah, no, if you talk to people, there are concerns that he is not really gripping things hard enough. There's also worries that he could come unstuck when the COVID inquiry resurfaces. One of the roles that Chris Wormald had was Permanent Secretary of the Department for Health, in charge of emergency planning ahead of COVID and during COVID, and picking through his role at the most critical moment in our nation's recent past. I think some people think could come out in the wash as fairly unpleasant. But I do think that there's a bit of an issue at the moment in this government, and that you also hear about, which is the concern about the sheer number of people who cop the blame for decisions. You know, they're sort of waiting for the axe to fall in other parts of Number 10 for the sort of mishandling of last week. Now there's briefing against the head of the civil servants service. You've also got just an incessant chatter about things like the future of Rachel Reeves. It looks to me as if Keir Starmer last week utterly tied himself to Rachel Reeves, but we will see. But there is just a big blame culture in the administration that Keir Starmer runs, and I think that has been noted by certainly quite a lot of people in Whitehall, and I wonder whether the public has started to pick it up. At least they've managed to find a man this time rather than a woman to pin the blame on, which often seems to be the problem.
Sure, that would never happen on this podcast, I tell you. The biggest challenge for the government domestically this morning is resident doctors, formerly junior doctors. They have renamed themselves, are intending to go on strike. Members of the British Medical Association, the BMA, have voted for 6 months of strike action lasting into the new year, demanding a 29% pay rise in that long-running dispute. NHS bosses have said more strikes will lead to inconvenience and more suffering for patients, and tens of thousands of cancellations of appointments, jeopardising the 10-year NHS plan and unveiled by Wes Streeting only last week.
So just a bit of background to this. When Labour came in last year, they got their checkbook out in order to stop strikes in the NHS. They thought that was a big priority, and it was a hugely controversial measure at the time and remains so. And over 2 years gave resident doctors, junior doctors, a 20% plus pay rise. And actually, resident doctors came out on top of the recent round of pay awards to public sector workers, but that hasn't been enough. And they have now decided that they're going to press the strike button. 90% of doctors in the BMA ballot voted in favour of industrial action, but the turnout was only 55%, meaning that only about a third of the 77,000 resident doctors working in the NHS actually voted in favour of this. Wes Streeting has said that junior doctors, he said that he will not forgive them and the public will not forgive them. And clearly, this is something that is going to disrupt the rollout of possibly the most important policy area that Labour needs to fix.
I'm so reminded of the Jeremy Hunt era, and I think this government, occasionally you find yourself looking at a Labour government which came in saying we're going to do things very differently to the Conservatives, but then the same problems keep seeping through the system. Jeremy Hunt, if you remember, had that very bitter and long standoff with junior doctors, as they were then known, and it really. He had to sort of face them down over time, but I think it did eat into the reform agenda, because when you're involved in those long-running tensions and strike action affecting a lot of the NHS, it's pretty hard at the same time to be motivating people to get on with the bigger changes that you want to make. Well, this does look, doesn't it, like it is coming back to Wes Streeting, who only a week ago, and I think he still feels that his 10-year plan, for reasons outside his control, obviously to do with the wheels coming off the government over the welfare bill, hasn't had quite the attention that he would like it to have. But he's had to really pivot pretty hard. The message seems tough from Streeting, that the public won't forgive doctors, the resident doctors, if they do strike. So there again, you're back into a kind of conflict vibe rather than a let's rebuild the NHS for the future. Now, I'm sure he will want to say that he can do both, but this does look like something that could eat into a bit of the the bandwidth that the government needs on healthcare reform. I don't know if you agree with that. Just putting two and two together, I just felt like I'd seen this movie before.
Oh, completely. The government is absolutely desperate to talk up success in the NHS even now. And I'm going to do something that I suspect ministers who go on broadcast rounds are going to find incredibly annoying, because anytime you listen to the Prime Minister downwards ask, "What have you achieved since coming into power?" Keir Starmer tends to reach for a statistic. He tends to say, "Well, we've got 4 million new appointments in the NHS. That is proof positive that we're beginning to fix things. Things are going in the right direction." Right? I want you to stop and pause every time you hear a minister or the Prime Minister talk up 4 million new appointments, extra appointments in the NHS. And the reason for that is because, of course, it is an accurate statistic. But Anne, I just want to give you the context, because it's definitely not the whole story. So, and this is a shout out to some work by our data and forensics teams that they've been doing over the last few months that I've been fronting on Sky. But what they're talking up is there are about in the region of 70 million appointments a year in the NHS. So proportionally, it's not a huge increase. But even more critically, what our team have discovered is that 4 million extra appointments is the equivalent of an 8% rise in the number of appointments since Labour took office. But that is a smaller rise than was going on under Rishi Sunak. Under Rishi Sunak, there was a 10.6% rise in the same period the previous year. In other words, the rate of increase in appointments in the NHS has slowed since Labour came to power. Yet that is the number one achievement cited by the Prime Minister for his whole government. It's the go-to statistic that he has, 4 million more appointments. And so, there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors there. I mean, the government would say that they're just at the start of the journey, that there's a long way to go, that they're fixing big problems, that they're making rapid improvements. But ultimately, the number one statistic reflects a slowing of the rate of improvement to when things were happening under Rishi Sunak. That underlines just how hard and challenging the situation is in the NHS.
Brings us back to the old productivity puzzle about the NHS, how you define productivity in healthcare being a bit different, obviously, to widget factories. So, but I think that you're right about that. And the other thing that feeds into that is, of course, you can up the number of appointments. In fairness, Conservative governments have also engineered this. If you get your first appointment, but then what needs to happen is then delayed. You count as having had an appointment, but it obviously hasn't addressed your underlying issues. So I think that's a really interesting data dive that you've done there with your colleagues, and it also reminds us that these reforms need to be watered or liberally sprinkled with funding to get underway at scale. I say the word funding and underlined because I know you like to keep an eye on whether the government's got enough money for what it's promised. So I thought I'd bat that one over to you.
I feel like you've given a spoiler there, because there is no money left, and the latest people to remind us that was actually the Office of Budget Responsibility, who did so yesterday. There was a report by the OBR yesterday, and it was just so eye-watering. It made clear there is no money left. So there isn't going to be just absolutely. When Wes Streeting says there's no cash to up the offer to junior, there really isn't the cash to up the pay to junior doctors. Britain cannot afford the array of promises it has made to the public, says the OBR, Richard Hughes, its boss. It said that ministers must now make hard choices on tax and spending before Britain's public finances become unsustainable. They were looking almost to shame ministers. I'm really wondering why the OBR is doing what they're doing, but they've done it. They pointed out that we've got the 6th highest level of debt, the 5th highest deficit, and the 3rd highest borrowing costs of 36 advanced economies. And this is the language of the OBR. It leaves us in a particularly vulnerable position. Now, the boss of the OBR, Rich, he's a really interesting bloke. He knows his politics back to front. Back in the olden days of the first of the Blair government, the 1997 Blair government, there wasn't a thing called the OBR. basically what would happen is that Ed Balls, who then was Gordon Brown's special advisor, would go and lean on the forecasting team inside the Treasury. And there'd be a lot of back and forth just to make sure that the forecast that they produced before each budget looked as kind of positive and as rosy as possible. Who did the forecasts for the government inside the Treasury at that point? It was Richard Hughes. Fast forward 20 years, this is the guy who absolutely intimately understands the role of forecasting, ministers, and politics. And he is just really, he's basically called out where we are as a country. It's a systemic, long running problem, but he has used words like vulnerable and begged Rachel Reeves at the next budget to sort things out and basically recognise that the sort of the precipitous nature of the potential crisis that we could be facing with the amount of money that we bring in compared to how much we spend. And I don't think you could have got a more stark warning.
I just wonder, is that more helpful though to Rachel Reeves than harmful at this point? Because as you say, the OBR has really now gone into full kind of flashing red lights mode, hasn't it? And it used to be a bit like mark the homework of the government, but it's a different tone, as you say. It's really interesting background on Richard Hughes there. But it does, in a way, if you have to do emergency measures and a sort of reboot that says there is no money left. And look, we also have the OBR saying that. Does that not make it a bit easier for the government? Because it can't all be there for a year in. So having someone say, you've just got to get this message, and to Labour MPs, that might be actually okay.
I think there's a really good point. It absolutely gives Rachel Reeves sort of arguments and credibility to raise taxes kind of quite substantially in the autumn. My problem is I don't think that saying I've just raised taxes by £20 billion, the OBR told me to do it, Gov, it is necessarily the winning argument that we could have.
I was trying, okay. I was just looking, as you would say, glass half full, glass half empty.
Let's look at the state visit in the last couple of minutes and see whether that's glass half full or glass half empty. Where are we with that?
It was a lot of glasses, very full last night. Champagne and sparkling wine, of English wine, of course, on offer there at that fantastic big banquet. This is day 2 of the great Entente Cordiale Amiable reboot. The talks getting underway in earnest, but some cracks are emerging. Clearly, the Prime Minister is banking on securing an agreement to send small boats arrivals back over to the French side in exchange for accepting asylum seekers from Europe if they have a legitimate case for joining relatives in the UK, the so-called one in, one out deal. But both sides are saying that this deal hasn't entirely landed. My colleagues at Playbook in Paris, reporting from briefings alongside Macron on this visit to the UK, that he is still emphasising the black market for labour and welfare payments. Oof, painful point that one to make if you come on a state visit. That is the pull factor that is affecting, as he sees it, these numbers. It's a big talking point for him. And one of my colleagues, Claire Calcutt, is alongside Macron over on the visit, is saying that the French are absolutely clear. They want more checks on the UK side to reduce undeclared work. Now, Nick Thomas-Symonds on the morning round, batting for Team Grand Bretagne, he is saying, no, well, this is actually not quite as tense as that suggests. Macron and Starmer are working on shared solutions. I do wonder whether this one in, one out deal, which relies really on being able to accurately assess the claim of someone that they have a legitimate relative in the UK, it isn't very complex to deliver. Partly because it just is. It means a paper trail that has to be followed in each case. And also, an official from the Home Office was saying to me last night, it does kind of work if you want to move something on with the French. But politically, is it really going to be satisfactory? If Keir Starmer's under pressure to have fewer people coming in full stop, he'll be getting that also from Reform and from the Tories, of course. Saying one in, one out, it's going to be quite hard to sell. What do you think?
I think that's I think that's right. I could also see the media tracking individuals kind of doing their own due diligence on whether people really have a family member, and there just will be things that have slipped through the net that will be sort of quite ugly news stories, I think, for the government. One of the sort of rows that's rattling around you just referred to is the extent to which President Macron talked about the need to address pull factors. I just want to say one concluding point, because the alarm's just gone off, which is obviously in the UK, we always have a tendency to see our own politics and what's going on in isolation. But it is just worth pointing out that over in the EU, pull factors for migration is the big story of the day, generally across the whole of the EU. The European Commission has a big plan that it's launching today about the future of aid spending. And essentially, at its heart, is a threat from Ursula von der Leyen to countries that receive EU aid spending, that they're going to pull that aid spending unless particularly African countries do more to stem the tide of migration. There's a big row about that over there. But the issue of pull factors is troubling quite a lot of EU nations. And so I'm not totally surprised it's on the lips of Emmanuel Macron, because it's the talking point in Brussels and elsewhere. And the Commission are trying to do something about that themselves this morning, although centre-left governments across Europe don't like the idea of a Europe-first policy and are objecting to that. So it's fraught everywhere, not just here.
For sure. And I guess if you're Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, you will politely agree that you're happy to do more about that black market for labour in the UK. Just hope to get some deal signed and then to press on with making it happen. I just don't feel we've heard the last of the detail on that one.
Well, there's a big press conference tomorrow, so we will find out what worked, what got through the negotiations, and what didn't. But our negotiating time is up, and 20 minutes has been breached. We must stop and pause. Prime Minister's questions later, and then a busy day. We will see how it all washes up in the morning.
Prime Minister's questions, what could possibly go wrong? See you tomorrow.